Hello and welcome back as we round the end of our look at muscle physiology, and we pay attention to the beginning of the story. And the beginning of the story has us looking at how exactly do we create this thing called an action potential that is triggering the entire cascade of events that you've been looking at with muscle physiology. And so let's go ahead and jump into this and take a look and see if we can make sense of the beginning of the story. By the way, this will be a really nice segue into the nervous system that we will begin looking at next. And so here is my example for you. I've got a classroom full of cats and dogs. I've got a hallway full of cats and dogs. And we're going to pretend that both cats and dogs are equal, meaning they both have a positive impact on the people that they are around. And so whether you've got a cat or whether you have a dog, you get that same positive effect. And so we're going to go ahead and let me just do this real quick. Pay attention to the screen. Things are going to move. Watch what happens. All right, so what just happened? Exactly, we just swapped one cat for one dog. One cat left, one dog came in. And technically, our amount of love and affection and positivity has not changed any, because both cats and dogs carry the same positive impact on us. So no change. We have the same amount of positivity in the classroom as we did before I ran the animation. All right. Cat left the room, a dog came in, everything is the same. But let's run this again. Okay, what happened that time? Exactly. That time, we had 3 dogs leave the classroom and 2 cats come in. We had 3 dogs. We had 3 dogs leave. We had 3 dogs leave and 2 cats join. Are these equal? Do we have the same amount of positive charge? Do we have the same amount of positivity now inside of the classroom as we did before? Or has this changed? Right. We have more positivity now outside of our classroom than what we do inside the classroom, because now we had an unequal swapping of the positivity found within our cats and dogs. And so our hallway is now slightly more filled with positivity than what the inside of our classroom is. Now you might be sitting there wondering, Young, what in the world does this all have to do with, these are actually pluses, what in the world does this have to do with action potentials? And you would be right to ask that question. And I would be right to go ahead and fill you in on the answer. And so let's look at the answer to this. So in my example, the dogs were actually sodium ions, and our cats were actually potassium ions. All right. Now, both of these, as you remember from chapter 2, are cations because they are both positively charged. And so because they both have a positive charge, they are cations. All right. The classroom The classroom is the cell, and of course the walls are the cell membrane, and the doorway, well, the doorway is a channel, or in this case, a pump. And in fact, this is a pump that is pumping positive ions one way, positive ions the other way. In other words, at some point in time, you're pumping against the concentration gradient of one of these guys because you're moving them at unequal rates. And that takes energy, which is why this is a pump. Right? In fact, we classify this as an ATP ACE. This is a pump that's going to use energy to move sodium and potassium. And so this whole pump right here is what we define as being a sodium-potassium ATPase. Right? And so this little example here actually kind of mimicked very well what we see within the membrane and how we initiate the creation and the formation of the action potential. And this whole process is what we refer to as membrane polarization. Right? Membrane polarization, which is the process of creating an unequal distribution of electrical charges across a cellular membrane. And what a polarized membrane does is a polarized membrane is then prepared for the potential of creating an action potential. And we define membrane polarization as negative 70 millivolts, or what you have been introduced to as resting membrane potential. And so we are looking at this process of how we make a membrane ready to go ahead and create and respond to an action potential. So what does this all look like? Well, I like to refer to this as charging a battery. Right? The key is to reach negative 70 millivolts. This is the key. All right? And how do we do that? Well, we do that by having an unequal distribution of charges along the poles. Right? Now, for us, right, the positive terminal is actually going to be the outside of the cell membrane, and the negative terminal is going to be inside the cell membrane, and the battery itself is going to be the cell membrane. And so what happens? Well, we see a distribution of charges across the cell membrane. And so what we see here is we see a ratio of 3 to 2. 3 sodium for every 2 potassium. All right? And so what that means is on the outside of our cell membrane, we've got 3 sodium for every 2 potassium that's found inside of the cell membrane or inside of the cell. And this distribution sets up polarization. Right? We've polarized this so that the outside of our cell membrane is more positively charged than the inside. Right? And we can keep doing this. There's another 3 sodium. There's another 2 potassium. There's another 3 sodium. There is another 2 potassium. There's another 3 sodium. There's another 2 potassium. All right? And so we see this polarization that has occurred, where the outside of our cell membrane is more positively charged than the inside of the cell, which is less positively charged. And in fact, that's what the negative is referring to. The negative tells us where there is more positive charge. That negative says that the outside of the cell membrane is more positively charged than the inside of the cell membrane. All right? So let's kind of look at this in the context of a cell membrane. All right? So what would lead this cell to become depolarized? All right? If it's polarized right now, and we know that it's polarized because we're at negative 70 millivolts. Right? This negative 0.07 volts is simply negative 70 millivolts. And so we know that this membrane is charged. We have more sodium outside. We have fewer potassium inside. And so if we wanted to cause depolarization, where the membrane was no longer polarized, we would have to go ahead and move sodium into the cell. Right? And when we did that, notice what happened to the charge. The charge went up to positive 30 millivolts. Now, a couple things that I need to address here. Right? We went from negative 70 millivolts to positive 30 millivolts. We were polarized here, and then we become depolarized as we head to positive 30 millivolts. But what voltage did we pass on our way from negative 70 to negative 30? I'm sorry, from negative 70 to positive 30. What voltage did we pass going from negative 70 millivolts to a positive 30 millivolts? Exactly. Negative 55 millivolts. We passed threshold. And when we passed threshold, what was created at that point in time? An action potential. An electrical stimulus was created as we moved from being polarized to depolarized. An action potential was created as we moved and went from negative 70 millivolts to positive 30 millivolts because we crossed threshold. So let's go ahead and continue with this, and let's see what happens next. Now, right now we're at positive 30 millivolts. Our membrane has depolarized. We've broken the membrane. So we've broken the membrane. It's no longer polarized. Right? We've depolarized the membrane. We're at positive 30 millivolts. Let's look to see what happens. All right? The question is, how do we regain polarization? How do we get back to resting membrane potential? So take a look at this. Watch carefully. Okay. Did you see it? Let me back it up. Let me replay this. Right? Watch over here. Watch what happens to the voltage as potassium moves out. Potassium moves, voltage dips to negative 80 millivolts, and then does what? Comes back up to negative 70 millivolts. Right? We go from positive 30 millivolts, we dip down to negative 80 millivolts, and then we come back up to negative 70 millivolts. Right? And what we've just seen is a cycle that has happened within the cell membrane. We've initiated what we call an action potential, and we've seen the resetting of the membrane. Now, one of the other things I do want to point out is I've separated here that sodium-potassium channel. And so the sodium moved here, the potassium moved here. Right? But understand that these are not two separate channels. These are one channel. Right? Both sodium and potassium would move through that one channel. Right? But check this out. We started with resting membrane potential. We started with resting membrane potential at negative 70 millivolts. A stimulus came by the channel and forced sodium to move in, which caused depolarization. What was, or what could have been, a stimulus that caused sodium to move in? Well, acetylcholine would be a stimulus. That would cause sodium to rush in, which would cause depolarization. Or an action potential that was traveling along the cell membrane that comes across a sodium channel could lead to depolarization. In other words, either one of these would lead to a movement of sodium into the cell membrane that would cause the cell membrane to go from negative 70 millivolts, crossing threshold, and leading to depolarization, coming to a positive 30 millivolts. Sometimes you'll see positive 50. Action potential gets sent, and then we have to repolarize. We have to reset the membrane. Right? But when we do reset the membrane, we don't just shoot for negative 70. We overshoot it. We go to negative 80 millivolts, what we term as being hyperpolarization. The reason for that, the reason for hyperpolarization is just in case. Just in case you don't hit negative 70 millivolts, just in case you don't get back to resting membrane potential, we make sure we do. We hit negative 80. It's kind of like if you're going out for the night and you anticipate that you're going to need $100 to go out for the night. How much money do you bring? Do you just bring $100? No, you always have a little extra. You might bring $130 or you might bring $150. Maybe you'll bring $200. Why? Not because you're going to spend it, just in case. Just in case you need that extra money. Just in case you run short. Just in case you don't hit negative 70 millivolts. We're going to make sure we do. And then what happens? After hyperpolarization, we go ahead and we actually return back to negative 70 millivolts. We hit that resting membrane potential. From a graphical perspective, this is what this all looks like. Right. Now this looks very similar to the muscle contraction that we looked at a couple of videos ago, and I would say you are correct. All right. Right here, this is resting membrane potential. All right. Some stimulus comes in, forces sodium to move into the cell, and as we do, we hit threshold, which sends the action potential. All right. Sodium still diffuses into the cell, leading to depolarization. All right. At this point in time, those sodium channels close, and now potassium begins to move into the cell in what we call repolarization. We come down and we hit hyperpolarization at negative 80 millivolts, and then we level back off to resting membrane potential. Once again, here we have resting membrane potential. All right, that's what we have right here. All right. Some stimulus comes by, sodium begins to enter in, and then we cross negative 55 millivolts or threshold. Action potential is sent. All right. And we are depolarizing the membrane. That's what's happening here as the sodium is rushing in. We reach that negative or that positive 30 to positive 50 millivolts. Right? Sodium channels close, potassium channels open. Potassium now is leaving the cell. It's exiting, which is allowing us to do repolarization of the cell membrane. All right. Except we don't just repolarize back to threshold. We come down to negative 80 millivolts or hyperpolarization. And then that excess potassium diffuses away, and we return to negative 70 millivolts or resting membrane potential. And so what does that all look like together if we run this as an animation? Well, what this looks like is something along these lines. Right, so what you're seeing here is you're seeing the change in the electrical charge as the channels are opening and closing, leading to, again, starting with resting membrane potential, leading into depolarization of the membrane, experiencing repolarization as potassium is leaving the cell, hyperpolarization at negative 80 millivolts, and then regaining resting membrane potential. Again, as you are crossing that threshold of negative 55 millivolts. And what you've just experienced is an action potential. This wave of depolarization and repolarization along a cell membrane. The action potential is sent. It goes to the next sodium channel, which is at negative 70 millivolts. Sodium rushes in, which depolarizes the membrane. The membrane crosses threshold. Another action potential is sent. Right? As that action potential is being sent, that channel now needs to repolarize. So potassium leaves, that channel experiences hyperpolarization and then repolarization. The action potential that was sent goes to the next sodium channel where it causes depolarization. A new action potential is sent, but that channel needs to reopen. And so you've got to look at this as there's two separate processes that are happening. There's the action potential that is traveling, and then there's the aftermath or the cleanup after the action potential is sent. All right, and that cleanup is repolarization and hyperpolarization, leading back to resting membrane potential. It's kind of like having the neighborhood kids come over. All right? The neighborhood kids coming over, that's the stimulus. All right? They come in and they're going to destroy the house. They're going to mess it up. They're going to play with things. They're going to leave the chairs untucked underneath of the table. They're going to have dirty dishes all over the place. All right? Your house has been depolarized. Those kids leave. That's that. Now they've left. Right? Kids left. That's the action potential leaving. You've now got to go back in and regain order. And so repolarization. Except usually you clean it better than what it was. That's hyperpolarization. Right? And then your house comes back to normal with a glass of wine in your hand. Resting membrane potential. I'm going to leave you with that, let you kind of digest that, and kind of go through and make sure that you can make sense of all of that. There'll be some questions, again, following through. And, of course, I'm always available to answer any of the questions that you may have. And so with that, I say, I'll see you on the flip side.